Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm a little bit congested, so I might sound like Adam Sandler this episode. But Steve, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, man. It's been forever, dude. We haven't talked in a long time.
Mate, we haven't spoken since you've upgraded your studio. I'm digging the mood lighting going on back there. It's fantastic.
It's purple, and then I can switch it to whatever color you want. Did you like purple or do you want a different color?
I love green. Can we do green?
Oh, God, green. Makes my skin look funky.
Let me see. Oh, yeah, bro. Nah, go back to purple, eh? It does make you look funky. You look like a gremlin. Yeah. Sorry, my apologies. Yeah, I thought that would be way cooler than what it was.
So what's been in the world, Steve? You got to get me into that. I need my fix of Spartan history.
Yeah, mate. Spartan history has actually been on a like an unforced hiatus. So I got to the period where the show was destined to get to, which was the Greco-Persian Wars. And when I got there, I experienced anxiety like I've never experienced before. I was like, what do I do now? Like, how do I tell the story from a Spartan perspective, which is what I've done basically since the start of the show. And I just started freaking out. So it's been 3 months since I've released an episode. I just released the next one, or the last one, yesterday. First one in 3 months, man. So yeah, it took me a long time just to figure out how I was going to do it, because in my head, I was always just going to tell it from a Spartan perspective. And it was pretty easy in periods before that. You could really just focus in onto it. But during the Greco-Persian wars, there's a conglomerate of Greek cities that are fighting against the Persians. So you've got to include other cities. And I really struggled with how I, tell it from a Spartan perspective, especially some of the big battles like the Battle of Marathon in 490, which was fought by the Athenians mostly against the Persians, and the Spartans weren't even there. But to leave it out would have made, the narrative have gaping holes in it. And I just was dissatisfied with that. So yeah, it took me a few months, and I've finally settled on a bit of middle ground. So I've got some experts coming on the show to help me walk through periods that I'm not very familiar with and not really qualified to speak about. And I've got some other sort of experts coming on to help me walk through the Spartan thing and really tackling it from a different perspective. It's sort of like people tell the story of Rome. It's got to be like, Crassus, Pompey, Caesar, Augustus, and Greek histories are the same. It's always, Marathon, Plataea, Thermopylae, Salamis, those sorts of things. So I just want to tell it from a different perspective. So it just took a long time to get it together. But yeah, man, we're all a go. We've got 5 or 6 interviews lined up to get through the period. And yeah, really, really happy to be back behind the microphone. But yeah, it's good to see you, man.
I'm curious to the anxiety aspect. Is that just because there's so many other influences that were going on back then that you don't want to just tell it from, like, I guess, one angle? You have to kind of look at them all.
Yeah, I think the listenership that I've developed over the last 3 years is very passionate, very patriotic, if I can use that word, when it comes to the Spartans. And I found, like, when I've gone off topic, or I've sort of, had a digression somewhere along the line, I've been getting a lot of sort of negative feedback. I mean, and it's fair enough too. The show's the Spartan History Podcast. Like, so, going off topic and talking about subjects that aren't really even loosely related to Sparta, you can understand why people,
it's not out of the blank. It's not out of the blank.
No, it's not. It's not out of the blank. So yeah, and I think that's, like, I don't really suffer from anxiety at all. And I would think it was, it's tied in with a bit of, I guess, just a bit of procrastination. Like, it's going to be a lot of work to get through this. It's the first sort of serious bit of work I've had to do. And I previously could just do it at my own pace. And I was in territory that nobody had really covered before. So I'm just sort of forging my own destiny. But, now it's coming into a period of time where, my listeners would have a very good idea about what happened, and they'd be expecting a certain, style of podcast, I guess, those episodes. So I was just freaking out a little bit about that. And in the background had, like, moving house, and I changed jobs, and my grandfather passed away as well. So I had a bit of stuff that I could, fob off and say, oh, this is my excuse for not doing it. But deep down, I was just scared shitless and, really just forging ahead and having a crack at it. That's where the anxiety came from.
I feel kind of the same anxiety with JFK stuff, mostly because it's very hard to talk about a historical event, mostly because you're going to get critics in anything that you do. But it's just difficult because it's like, well, who's writing the history then? Because, like, I'm learning stuff that I never even thought. Like, I hear so many perspectives about JFK, about, like, he changed and he was this amazing peace person. I was like, yeah, towards the end though, but everyone forgot he ran on the platform of being a cold warrior. like he was brutal in the beginning, but then he noticed how bad like nuclear weapons war and how bad like all these ideas of like just, you have kids and you're about to have your kids grow up with nuclear destruction around them if we're talking about like launching nukes at each other, and realize he made pieces for speech and everything. It's like, yeah, but that was towards like the end of his presidency. And that's like a controversial take because JFK fans will be like, oh, how dare you say that? It's like, well, you got to like accept the change aspect. Like people don't just start off as goody two shoes. They have a different background and all, and you start learning different parts about history. And I can only think that has to be more complicated with an aspect of like just the ancient times. First of all, the historical record, we're pulling records and we're always learning something new. Like Atlantis could be real. That's awesome. I'm happy that that's an idea. I mean, it makes more sense when you read Plato's accounts of Atlantis. It's like, is he describing, like he's saying Atlanteans? Is that just people that he's never, they're not Americans. They're just something different. They're not maybe underwater sea people like we make them in movies now. But you start getting into this aspect when they talk about Atlanteans or Atlantis. Is it just an advanced maritime culture, people that have sea exploration abilities farther that exceed everybody else's? And it makes more sense now. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Atlantis is a tough one too, because well, Plato on the back of, I guess, um, Socrates and other thinkers earlier on in the 6th and 5th century all had references towards it, and Plato goes into, I guess, the Egyptian theory of it, and the Egyptians to the ancient Greeks were, already an extremely ancient and very harmoniously religious people in the Greeks' mind. Like a lot of Greek architecture and art sort of took its leading from Egyptian culture. So, it's almost like a sage telling the Greeks something. Like if the Egyptians said something to the ancient Greeks, they'd by and large take it as gospel. But yeah, look, I mean, all that sort of stuff, it's all about the lens through which it's viewed. And the problem with your JFK stuff is that because it's so recent, everybody's viewed that situation through their own sort of, ideologies and preconceptions, and they've all got their own opinions. So I guess, trying to find two people that agree on what happened with JFK, it's going to be very, very difficult from your standpoint. But I've actually listened to some of the episodes that you've had on there. You've had some pretty fascinating discussions, very robust discussions about the whole thing. It's fascinating. I mean, from an Australian's perspective, obviously, I wasn't alive when JFK was president, but my mother was alive, and America is such a big influence on Australian culture. She spoke very fondly of JFK, and it was one of her earlier memories. Not seeing him assassinated, obviously, but hearing the news about it. And, it was an epochal event over here that such a thing could occur in a place like America. And the fact that the myth has persisted for what's on better part of 60 years now, whether it was, a government hit job, the Russians' involvement, was it just a madman in Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone? Like, there's so many theories there. So I think the fact that it's still undecided should tell you that there's something wrong there. Because if it's one of those things, it's got a truth about it, and an actual truth, not a subjective truth, an objective reality, then they could just lay it out and shut everybody up.
The Australian just country in general has helped and hurt the JFK assassination. The reason why I say that is that it opened up more people to be curious. There was a newspaper article that came out about Kennedy's death, and it was about the Kremlin policy in the Soviet Union, KGB defectors basically, and talked about assassinating Western officials. And in the thing, they talked about they had this little ice pen that they could stab somebody, and this was printed in their newspaper. A little ice pen that would leave no really visible mark, but would kill someone in a couple of days. And also another spy tactic, which was to lure someone to, and I swear to you, to a telephone during a thunderstorm and have it like an exposed wire to get them electrocuted. That's a legit thing that was posted in an Australian newspaper, where the CIA, I pulled that off their website, that said document of like information or, secrecy from Australia or something like that. Because you guys were alerting just your general public, and it was going to end up catching up over here. And the CIA wanted to get on top of that and try and cover their ass as much as possible. So when I say you've helped and hurt, is the aspect of you've alerted a lot of people to it through that newspaper, but at the same time, the government tried to seal their like locks even tighter and be like, okay, this is not just going to be an American thing. This is going to be a universal world thing. And that's when they really kind of started covering their asses with documents. But I mean, when it comes to history, though, my take is I think everyone should just say whatever their perspective is. I don't really mind it a whole lot, but I do want to get the historical record straight. And I think you can't really make any final options until there's a definitive, like I'm only going by documents to be able to do that. But like, how do you go by documents with something in ancient times? Like the Egyptians, Do you think every hieroglyph of all the skinny Egyptians, do you think all of them were skinny? No. If you look at Egyptian culture back then, they never wrote down anybody that was fat because they seen that as a sign of weakness. And they didn't write that down. I think it was Mike Tyson who told me that too. Now, before I say that, Mike Tyson on a Joe Rogan episode talked about how like they were finding mummies and pharaohs with cocaine in their hair and all this type of stuff. But a lot of people don't know about these types of things because that was obviously what they did in their free time, but it would look bad if your, subjects knew that the king died of like a cocaine overdose or they were, addicted to coke or something like that. So they never wrote that down and they never made that public. And that's stuff we're now finding out now. And I go, it kind of makes sense when you're talking about recording history. You don't really record the bad stuff. Like you don't write in a journal. I mean, fuck, if we used our Facebook posts as like a historical record, that's all the bad shit. Everybody's always complaining about, oh, my dog just died. It's like, Jesus Christ. But I mean, people write down the good stuff in letters and stuff, and they let them know to their family members most of the time. So your historical record's a little bit probably skewed to the own issues that you're really not, or you're not talking about. So we get to an aspect where you mentioned, the fight between, I guess, the community right now when it comes to an aspect of making if Achilles, or it's Achilles, and who was the second person?
Patroclus.
Okay. I think, if I'm not mistaken, isn't that the movie Troy or whatever that movie was, where they had this, like, it looked like there was a kind of like they were hinting at a deeper relationship between the two guys. And I mean, is that influence from that movie alone? If that movie wasn't there, didn't show it at that angle. I mean, I'm trying to look at it from the perspective of like, there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of things, especially when you don't have full details on exactly what this event is. Like you could say the Cubans were involved in killing JFK. Is it true? Probably not. It's probably something else, but there's weight there to say that because of the fact we try to kill Castro 693 times. I mean, so you get into this aspect of like, is someone making an improper assumption by saying that? Well, they're going off something where they think that's how it is. And if you're looking at like a historical record, I mean, we knew a lot of the Spartans were gay. So then people would talk about like, well, everyone, it was just a thing back then. Nobody even thought of it like that. And it's like, I could see the weight behind that. But what would be your point?
Yeah, look, I guess to not go too far out into the weeds, but that particular, I guess, conflict that you just described there between Achilles and Patroclus is really getting my goat at the moment. Like, and you're absolutely right. Look, you've got to get the sources in alignment, and that's very tough when it comes to ancient sources because we only have a limited amount of what is extant. We often only have, maybe one at best two sources for any given event. So it's very tough, but people so often, cast aspersions backwards through history when the last thing the people in history were doing was looking forward to saying, oh shit, I wonder what the people in 2020 America or Australia are going to be thinking about what I just did now. And you find when you get into that sort of habit, you start putting your own current prejudices on the past, and those things are completely irrelevant. So the Achilles and Patroclus one's particularly annoying due to the fact that even the classical Greeks who came after the time of Homer, after the time of the legendary battle at Troy, weren't really sure what happened in the Archaic period, which was the period, of course, where Homer was writing the Iliad about a battle that took place 400 years before his own time. There's not a single implicit or explicit mention of a homosexual relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. But the problem with the modern era is that unless there is, then the Iliad isn't inclusive. If it's not inclusive, then it needs to be cancelled. So people have to, insert these things into the narrative itself, and it annoys the absolute shit out of me because you've already cited that the Spartans, practiced homosexuality. The Athenians did. In fact, all of the Greeks did in the classical period. And you actually have authors in the classical period of which we have some of their works still extant. Aeschylus is one, and I think Sophocles was another who wrote stories about the Trojan War and made Achilles and Patroclus gay in those stories. But other writers completely, left that out. And a lot of the myths that were written about in the 5th century Athenian playwright era, they change things. It's stage, it's movie. You change the story. You watch a documentary or a fictional documentary about some historical event, and any historian will tell you that they pick and choose what they want. The movie 300 is a prime example. But the fact that there isn't a single reference of homosexuality between Achilles and Patroclus is very telling to me. And Homer's explicit in everything that he wrote. He's verbose, he's grandiose. He went into a lot of detail. He didn't leave anything hidden. There was a deep pathos between those two. But you've got to counterpose that against the style of society that the archaic society likely was. And it was very homo, I guess, focused in that, it was men on men companionship, probably for the most part. You're fighting with these people side by side in war. You don't want to let those people down. So you had deep feelings, and women, for better or for worse, were considered inferior, as they were in the classical period as well. Even Aristotle assumed that women had absolutely no soul whatsoever. So men were more encouraged to form deep and lasting bonds with other men. Now, this bled into homosexuality, in some cases state-sanctioned pedophilia, like in Sparta and in parts of Athens as well. But there's not a shred of evidence for it anywhere in the archaic period. And the classical Greeks didn't know it either. So it doesn't stand to reason that the guys living 400 years after an event would know less than what we know now, 2,500 years after the event itself. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. And to me, it just seems like the general, attempt at wokeifying absolutely everything out there. And it really gets me.
Have you ever heard of Hadrian's Wall?
Of course. Yeah.
Didn't that guy build a bunch of statues after a boy that he liked or something like that? There's like a statues of a. Okay, so if there's
continuous,
if there's any evidence like that, then that's a proper assumption. But if there's no evidence like that on this case, then you have to be like, then you might just be adding a fantasy element to it. I mean, it's not illogical or it's not irresponsible to do that, but at the same time, like what I started noticing with I'm going to try and relate it with my Kennedy stuff, is that when I started noticing is this person telling me the historical record, or are they adding details that's going to fit their narrative to sell a fucking book? And that's where you have a lot of cases, scenarios where people start inventing incidences that never happened. I'm like, well, I don't have documentation on that. And the issue with not having the documentation is they have memos saying burn this fucking document when you're done with it. So it's like I don't know. It's just an improper assumption, which I just go, for anybody like myself that likes the historical, just wants the historical record and get the right facts, I'd rather know that first. But you got to also imagine how many kids are coming up now and they're going to be learning about Achilles and they're going to be learning about this. If that's added into the books and it's not necessarily correct, then you're giving everybody a false history. And that's when the whole narrative drives the complete opposite direction. It's not being anti-woke or anti-this, but it's also like you want to get the historical record of it set straight rather than try and add something that necessarily might not be there. Because if you lead, that's like saying George Washington was Asian. It was like, was he? No, we know that. But if you add that in a movie, then all the kids just see that movie for the first time and never read a history book, and they're going to start assuming that this is going to be. And a lot of these stuff, like especially we talk about ancient Greece, there's only certain aspects they focus on in history class. So if somebody hears it on an episode or sees it in a movie, they're just going to assume that's the correct thing. I remember when I saw Troy, I thought, hey, that could be a possibility. Achilles could be gay, but is it true? I mean, where's the historical evidence for it?
Yeah. And look, I guess in a lot of ways, like that kind of relationship between men would be associated with, homosexuality in this day and age, like the kind of love that you had for, for another man. We don't have that in our society today. Like we just don't have it. So it would look to a passerby, to an inconsistent reader of history, they'd probably say, oh yeah, look, he was, in a state of lamentation for days. He couldn't bear to bury his body. He was weeping over the corpse. He sacrificed 1,000 Trojans, to him. He was screaming to the gods for begging for one more day with him. Like, yeah, I get where they're coming from, but it's not explicit in the Iliad. There's not a single reference to it whatsoever. And Homer doesn't shy away from sexuality whatsoever, particularly between Hector and his wife, Andromache, where there's a couple of scenes of deep passion. Like, Homer knows what he's doing. He's doing something that nobody before him had ever done before. And really, though they tried, nobody did after. To try and distort his work to fit the modern narrative is a crime. And you're right. Like, if we can't agree on what happened before based on fact, then we're going to have a lot of trouble trying to figure out how we're going to move forward in this world. Because if we can't get the past right, we're screwed in the future.
I also think people have to look at timelines. Like 2020, you can't look at anything with the eyes that we have now back then. But like, I mean, how many people died in war and they were just buried right beside their loved one, or not loved one, but beside their co-worker, not co-worker, I guess co-battler, co-warrior that they were with, someone that they just died in war with. You'd have a bunch of troops that were dead that you'd line up, or you bury rocks, put on top of them or something like that, side by side by side. Does that mean every single person there was in a gay love relationship? No, they all just died in the same battle, and this is the best place to keep them all organized in one spot. Now, translate that over to around, probably my example would be the Western times. They buried people specifically next to their family members. It doesn't matter if they died 4 towns over or whatever, that body would be transferred back and tried to buried with his family in that family little area. And now we have what we have now is family plots, or people try and put their gravestone right beside their family members. But ancient times, they never did that. It was right where you died in that area. They would bury your body in a specific spot. They felt like this would be a good spot for you to be buried. So when you find two soldiers or whatever that died in the same exact position with rocks buried on top of them, do you just go, these two are in a love relationship? No, it's an improper assumption because of the aspect of, okay, were they in a battle? And then this is where they could bury them. I mean, it's that little time translation. It doesn't seem like it's significant, but it's very significant because we just changed our whole morals and values. I mean, maybe in ancient times they carried a body back home or something like that, but most of the time you're burying them where they died in battle. I mean, look at the Norse people. When they died in battle, they thought they were going to Valhalla. They didn't necessarily even care besides giving them a Viking burial or burning them like that. So then you have no significant traces of anybody of this aspect or assumptions that led to this thing where they could have been a romantic feud or a romantic thing in between two people.
Yeah, yeah. I'll give you two examples. One supporting your argument, and one sort of where archaeology has sort of proven something in regards to affection between sort of soldiers that are buried. You take one, mass burials after giant campaigns such as the Battle of the Somme in World War One or something along those lines, where archaeologists in the future will dig these up and find thousands of skeletons stacked upon one upon another. It would be foolish to assume that those 2,000 people were in a massive orgy before they all died, buried them together.
But well, we can hope. We can hope.
Well, hopefully it was a good one anyway, worth dying for. But on another one, there was actually there was a band in a town called Thebes, which was an antagonist of the Spartans in the 4th century, and ultimately they were the first to properly crush the Spartans on the field of battle in several hundred years. And they had a band that was risen up out of the Theban population called the Sacred Band. And they're mentioned in a few historical sources, but like a lot of other things that are similar, they can be considered sort of a fantastical retelling. It was supposed to be 300 soldiers, and the number 300 was obviously, well, the significance isn't lost to us now, and it certainly wasn't lost to the Spartans when they were coming up against the 300, just considering it was about 100 years after the Battle of the Hot Gates, Thermopylae. Anyway, in the 330s, I believe it was, obviously Alexander the Great was up and coming. King Philip was still reigning in Macedon, and the Thebans had revolted along with the Athenians against a Macedonian held alliance, a Greek alliance, which was eventually designed to go over and start kicking the Persians' ass. But anyway, Thebes and Athens break away, and they fight the Macedonian aligned forces at the Battle of Chaeronea in, I think it's 337 BC. At any rate, through some pretty good generalship on Philip's behalf and some stunning cavalry actions of Alexander, they absolutely smoke the Athenians and Thebans, and they wipe out the Sacred Band almost to a man. 300 people made up of 150 homosexual pairs. And it was designed that way, you would try to emulate each other's bravery on the battlefield. Quite often, even in Spartan lines, like it would be a homosexual pairing in the battle line for that very reason. You wouldn't want your lover to see you, turn tail and run. You'd want to, strive for more excellence in front of them. Anyway, the fact that the band existed probably wasn't in doubt, but that they almost died to a man was definitely something that was sort of, up in the air with modern historical thought, until they'd done some archaeology, some digs on the actual side of the battlefield, and they came across a separate burial ground that had, I think, from memory, about 127 pairs of individuals all buried right next to each other in their groupings and things like that. And it was just that little piece of archaeology put together with the story of the Sacred Band and the Battle of Chaeronea basically proved undoubtedly that the Sacred Band not only existed, but they were crushed as a unit and a fighting force and were buried on the field of the battle. So it's sort of, it can go both ways as to what you're saying.
Wouldn't that affect also, like if in particular, like if you had a son and a father in the same battle, and the son's probably not going to bury his dad, or his dad's not going to bury his son near any of the other soldiers. He's going to set it like that's why you probably have some that would be recluse from all the others. They're just separate all the way from the pack. We would consider that at a point first coming up on archaeology, probably would be an archaeologist would say, oh, he was an outcast, or he was one of these like recluses or away from the original group, when necessarily it might just actually be in good gracious that, oh, I'm going to bury my own father away from the rest of the bodies and have him separate because this will be more exclusive to how much I cared for him.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I know that for the 300 or 301 Spartans that went to Thermopylae, they were chosen because they had sons. And so they had actually a male heir to carry on the throne. There's a term called oliganthropia, which basically means, I guess translated loosely, the slow creep of excess denuding populations. So the Spartans were all they were oligarchs. They weren't really, soldiers. They were actually nobles. They had land holdings. They had slaves, every one of them. And as they were intermarrying, the family plots were getting bigger and bigger, but the population of people that could maintain their citizenship was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So even in 480, 481, prior to the battle, the Spartans were already suffering from a population decline of about 2,000 from their heights of about 8,000. They had about 6,000 by the time, actual male citizen Spartans by the time of that battle. So in order to get selection for the battle to accompany King Leonidas to the pass, you had to actually have a son to carry on your line. It's one of those things where they say, well, they knew it was a suicide mission. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done such a thing. They knew that none of those guys were coming back.
We definitely drifted into the weeds a little bit from the main point, but did Achilles have relationships with women?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, Achilles' relationship with the woman and his deprivation of that woman is actually the flashpoint of really Greek antagonism at Troy. So what happens is, obviously, the battle lasted for 10 years, but Homer's narrative picks up the story about 3 weeks from the finish of the battle. So there's been 9 years and 11 months of the battle that's occurred before Homer actually starts his narrative. He jumps around a little bit back and forward to give a bit of context, but there are other books in the epic cycle that haven't come down to us that covered those parts of the battle. But in one of the earlier stages, they raided a nearby town, and Achilles captured as part of his war booty the daughter of the head priest of Apollo of that town. The head priest of Apollo's name was Chryseis, and the daughter was Briseis, and he took her back as his own. My mistake. Sorry. Chryseis was the one Agamemnon captured. She was the daughter of the priest of Apollo. Achilles took Briseis. Anyway, to appease Apollo, Agamemnon had to give Chryseis back to her father because Apollo was afflicting the Greeks with the plague. And then Agamemnon, in a fit of pique, is like, well, if I lose something, I want Achilles to lose something as well. So Agamemnon took Briseis away from Achilles, and she was his, well, she refers to him as her husband, I guess, in the Iliad, but she was basically a sex slave. He didn't treat her as such, but for better or for worse, that's what she was. She was a camp slave. So yeah, Achilles had relationships with women. He was well known as a very attractive man, and sonnets were written about him in some poems that came out in the 6th, 5th century about his beauty, about his womanizing. So he was very, very heterosexual. Yes, he had strong relationships with the males around him, in particular Patroclus, but he was first and foremost a heterosexual warrior, as I'd suggest most people in the archaic age were.
So is the only evidence to the fact that they had a strong relationship that there might be a correlation to him being homosexual?
Yeah. Everybody cites I think it's in book 19 with Patroclus's funeral and the depths of pain that Achilles experiences through there. And there's a few, because they're cousins, and he's sort of like a little brother, big brother kind of thing. Achilles is sort of banished at one stage, and he's sort of raised in Patroclus's home, and so they're very close in that regard. Then there's some 5th century works of poetry, works of stage, that infer that there's a homosexual relationship between the two of them, and that's it, really. And then it's just the modern narrative where everything has to be inclusive. So we've got to, if it's not there, we'll invent it.
So instead of remorse for a tragic loss, it's picked up from remorse of like a lover's remorse towards someone who just died. Okay.
Yeah, they say they go that Achilles goes so overboard, and look, he does. It takes up an entire book. He builds a massive pyre. He sacrifices numerous Trojans, to the spirit of Patroclus. He weeps over the body. He won't bury it for days and days and days on end. He's so angry about what had happened that he goes and commits single combat against the Trojan hero Prince Hector. It's like he's in a he's pissed off. He's just lost his best friend. Moreover, he lost so the first word of the Iliad is menon. In ancient Greek, that word means rage. And the first line is basically rage, goddess. Tell me about the rage of Peleus' son, brilliant Achilles. That's the first line of the Iliad. And that's what the Iliad's about. The Iliad's about Achilles' rage. At first, it's his rage for having Briseis, his prize, taken away from him by Agamemnon. And secondly, it's his rage at himself because he decides to not commit to the battle. Patroclus convinces him that, let me lead the troops, let me put on your armor. So he presents to the Greeks as Achilles in the image of Achilles and gets struck down by Hector in battle.
Oh shit. Okay. So it's like a guilt thing. He sent his best friend into battle. Didn't necessarily want to, but was kind of coerced into by his best friend. And then his best friend dies, thinking that it was Achilles, dressed up as Achilles.
Yep, 100%. 100%.
That's a guilt trip. Then he probably feels like shit. That's why he's doing so much for it.
100% he feels like shit. Yeah. And as you would, like if your little brother, your best friend, says, look, if you're not going to fight, I'm going to go and fight. Like at least give me your armor, so I can go through and lead your troops, your Myrmidons into combat. And Achilles is like, I don't care what you do. But he gives him a warning. He says go out and fight the Trojans. But whatever you do, don't take on Prince Hector. And that's, of course, what happens. Patroclus comes across Prince Hector and gets struck down in combat by Prince Hector. And Hector knows that the moment that happens, that he's going to die. He knows it instantaneously. He has some discussions with his wife. There's a really beautiful scene where he's leaving for battle through the Scaean Gate, which is the main gate where most of the fighting happened in Troy. And he meets his wife, Andromache, at the gates. And she's carrying her little son, their son together, called Astyanax. And, had this moment of really deep love where he's like, she's like, don't go, stay inside, don't go out there. Like if you go out there, you're going to die. And if you die, the city's going to crumble. Like what will happen to me? What will happen to your son? And Hector's like, I've got to go. And he leans over to kiss his son on the head, but he's got a helm on with a horse plume out the helm. And as he bends over to kiss Astyanax, the horse plume gets in the child's face and gets him a little bit scared. And he puts the helmet on the ground and he and his wife share a little laugh like, oh, isn't he cute? Like it's a really touching and beautiful scene. But Hector knows when he goes out that gate, that is it for him. The rage of Achilles will find him and it will destroy him and the gods will sanction that.
Dude, this shit's fascinating as hell to me. I don't know why. I can see where it's controversial just because, a lot of parts of history are kind of controversial now. Just because, you get your own, the way the way you explained it in the beginning was okay, I was starting to think maybe there is a love connection there. But then when you start looking at oh no, he went to battle dressed up as Achilles and got killed. How much weight is now going to be on his shoulders that he just let his best friend die because not necessarily that he had to, but was kind of coerced into letting his best friend dress up as him and then go into battle in this sense and then gets killed. Yeah, that's a massive guilt trip.
Huge guilt trip. And not only that, a woman was involved in that. It was his, I don't know if you could say.
Wait, did she die? That's the main question.
No, Briseis didn't die. But she was eventually returned to Achilles, which was
kill her?
No, he didn't kill her.
That's how you know it's a guilt trip.
Yeah, he wanted to kill Agamemnon, but that was where, his fit of pique came. It didn't come from, some sort of lover's scorn between him and Patroclus. It came because Agamemnon, as overall king of the Greek army, took away his woman. And that's what made him truly pissed off to start with. The Patroclus dying by Hector's hand, that's what brought him back into the war, but it was a woman that knocked him out. And once he was knocked out of the war, the Trojans had run of the place. They actually flipped the tables on the Greeks and they besieged the Greeks at their ships. And you get this really interesting scene where the Greeks have set up a wooden palisade around where all their ships are moored, and they're the ones being besieged rather than the Trojans back in Troy. The Greeks are actually fighting them at their ships close to Achilles' ships. He can hear the battle going on and he won't go out there and fight. He's that upset about what Agamemnon's done to, besmirch his honor, take his woman.
How much of historical impact is his death to the whole, just Greeks in general?
It's actually ties into the Greco-Persian Wars, if you can believe it. Herodotus, who wrote the histories, he's sort of the father of modern history. He's probably the best and only account we have of the Greco-Persian Wars. He starts off in book one laying down what he sees as the casus belli, or the pretext for the Greco-Persian Wars, and he cites the events at Troy as one of them, as in the East and the West coming together for some reason. But what had happened before that? There was a couple of instances where, like, some Phoenician sailors landed in Argos, and they took away the Argive princess Io as a captive. And then later on, there were some Cretan sailors in Tyre, which is on the Levantine coast, and they took away a Tyrian princess called Europa. And then Jason the Argonauts went over there as well, and they stole not just the Golden Fleece, they took Medea too. So there's back and forth of like princess stealing before the East and West. But Herodotus cites Troy as the part where things really ramped up. Like, stealing princesses is one thing, but stealing a princess and then coming after her with the largest force ever assembled by the Greek world, that is the Greek force at Troy, that was like really tipping the scale. So Herodotus actually cites that as the reason why the Persians decided to fight the Greeks, and the Greeks the Persians in the Greco-Persian Wars. Now, of course, the Persian Empire didn't exist in 1200 BCE when the legendary Trojan War took place, but as inheritors of both Asia Minor, Turkey, and the Caucasus, where Medea came from, they inherited the ancestral anger, guilt, the need for revenge. So that's where Herodotus sees. So it actually did have some ramifications down in history. And believe you me, as surely as the Bible is what we would consider a canonical text in these days, the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the Iliad in particular, was that to the ancient Greeks. It was the Bible. It told them where their history came from, where the religion, where the history came from, where they came from. In fact, like they are the spiritual successors to those Greeks that fought underneath the walls of Troy.
Well, some of the biggest historical impacts in your mind, what would you say would be the biggest causations for the actions that were taken? That would be, I guess, major strides in historical record that we have. I mean, a lot of people, like during I wouldn't say colonialism. I guess the colonial era, I would say a lot of stuff was considered to be just land grabs and a lot of trade stuff. But also there was there was a large entitlement issue that gets weighed in as well too. Like you can look at anything and you could be like, okay, if this person sailed halfway across the globe just to go over here, was that just on accident? Was that just for exploration, or did something happen? Like I've heard an event from a friend of mine who's an archaeologist, an underwater archaeologist that specifically focuses on like that colonial period, that maritime culture. And there was an issue where a slave had been picked up and taken by someone else without any permission. And it was just seen as like a slight to that person. So he's traveled all this way just to get that one thing back. Where a giant historical event happened where it's like, why would that wouldn't, the way we looked at it is like, oh, they just went over there and wanted to capture their land. It was like, actually, no, they had a pre-connection before that and it fueled that. I mean, because you got to look at the large justification for why we think that a certain material lands in another spot. Well, it was from trade. Well, how did that happen? Well, at some point they interconnected and they did this. Was it that, or was it something like with the British when they brought opium over to China and got all these people addicted to that type of stuff? I mean, that was a dirty thing that they did, but in the historical, I mean, it's ravaged them for generations, basically. I mean, they knew what that drug was. They experienced it. They knew how difficult it was. And they thought this would be a great weapon to use against them. And they did do it like that. But we looked at it like, oh, they must have traded it over there. And then now we know the right historical part to it. So how many historical events in Greece, ancient Greece, that you've come across, at least through all the talks that you've done, and also the research that you've done, that have been fueled in a specific way that we thought it was, but necessarily it was because of something else?
Yeah, look, all of them, to be honest. I mean, I'll focus on the Greco-Persian Wars. I mean, Herodotus himself gives, two reasons why the war itself started, and really, upon not to doubt Herodotus too much, but most people do in certain elements, the actual truth to how the wars started sort of doesn't really align with either of his reasons. And Herodotus isn't, he's very impartial. He says, look, this is what the Persians say. This is what the Greeks say. I'll leave that up in the air, let that percolate in your mind. You make up your own mind. But piecing together, the story behind the narrative, when you read between the lines a little bit, and then other stuff that came later, you can see that events to that war in particular were very contemporary. Whereas Herodotus casts back, 700-800 years before and builds this whole, miraculous timeline that, led the East and the West to this point where they had no choice but to come together and have conflict. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, you ask two parties in a war, and they'll both have vastly different reasons for why they're fighting. Moreover, the third parties, the people that are observers, they'll have their own ideas as well, based on what ideologies their countries are promoting, what propaganda they're getting, what side of the alliance they fall on. I think war is one of those mercurial things that the truth is almost impossible to ascertain. I think at a fundamental level, almost every war that I can think of in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Assyria, any of the ancient empires had to do with somebody had something that somebody wanted, and they wanted it bad enough, and they had the power to go and get it. And that's what most of the Roman conquests were about. That's what most of the Greco-Persian wars were about. That's what the Peloponnesian War was certainly about. That it was that somebody had something you wanted, and I'm going to go and take it. And that's the War of Independence really in America is that at a very, very fundamental level. The British had their colonies revolt against them, and they wanted it back. So they were going to do whatever they could to get it back. And the Americans like, no, this is ours. We're going to keep it. Those fundamentals are basically homogenous across every war that I can think of.
It's called capitalism, my friend.
God bless it.
When it comes to the Iliad from Homer, how much of that does that impact our historical knowledge, I would say?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. No, it's a good one. Yes, like how much has it impacted? I think it'd be impossible to gauge how much it has impacted, because Homer's retelling of the war has impacted every historian that came after him. Certainly, Herodotus had that in his mind when he was laying out the narrative for the Greco-Persian Wars. Thucydides had Homer and Herodotus in mind when he was penning the works on the Peloponnesian War. The Iliad is a canonical text for really anything that's come after in Western literature. And I think you can see that with how pervasive ancient Greek and ancient Roman culture is, even in the modern era. You go and look at all of your buildings of power in government. They're all based on Doric or Ionic column, Greek designs. Even our structures of government, particularly in America, it's almost a carbon copy of the, I guess, late Republican Roman Senate in the way of the the executive function, and then the House and the Senate. Those things are absolutely influential on today. But getting back to your original question, I think without Homer and without the Iliad, we have an entirely different way of perceiving truly epic events. And we can't really speak to what that would be like, because we don't have we do have the Iliad and the Odyssey, but I'd say without it, we'd be looking at things vastly different.
What's his background? What's Homer's background?
Now, Homer's an interesting character. Most people will tell you that he was a blind poet. Homer was likely illiterate, and you can tell that by, if it was really one person, usually it's just conglomerated onto the figure of Homer, but it was likely told by numerous people. And you can see in the way that the Iliad is written, it's designed to be read. It uses a lot of simile, a lot of repetition, and a lot of, for lack of a better term, alliteration. So it's one of those things that's very easy to, well, not very easy for us, because we have offshored our mental capacity to a phone. But for people in ancient times, pre-literate people who couldn't write things down, it was one of those things that's very simple to memorize, I guess. But Homer was apparently blind. He was apparently an Ionian Greek by most tellings. That is, that he came from the west coast of Turkey. And the Greek that certainly was the style of Greek that was the Iliad was originally recorded in was in the Ionic alphabet, Ionic script. There was three main different types: Doric, which was predominantly where the Spartans came from; Ionic, which was Athens and the west coast of southwest coast of Turkey; and Aeolian, which was north of Athens and northwest coast of Asia Minor. So the Iliad is written in the Ionic thing. But apart from that, there's no fewer than 8 different cities that claim Homer was there. He's one of those semi-liminal figures that it's very impossible. He's like Gossamer. You can't put your finger on Homer. But for ease of speech, we say that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by Homer. There are other works that are called they're basically called Homer-esque, which were written by people later, and they're written in the style of Homer, but people who have much more skill in linguistics than I do can tell that they're not actually authentic. So the only two texts that Homer wrote were the ones that we had, and it's suggested by historians that out of the I think it's about 11 books in the two epic cycles, that those two were the most popular and they were the best because they were copied the most, and we have them today.
So you got a lot of mimics out there that are trying to copy the style of Homer. Because I'm just trying to figure out what his bias would be. Like, does he have a bias? If he's outside eyes looking in, like if you're not necessarily from the place that you're writing about, you're probably going to have a different perspective than someone who's been born and raised in wherever that place is being written about. But also an issue and kind of what I like but don't like about a lot of like historical stuff, especially stuff with like JFK. There's people using pseudonyms in their writing, like that it's not their real name, they're under something else, and they might be actually giving you a fairy tale, or they might be giving you the real information, and they're afraid that they're going to get killed for the things that they're talking about, so that's why they use like a cryptonym, or they use something like that to hide their true identity. And it gets into this point. I mean, if you have a bunch of people that write in the style of Homer, and then you're able to decipher if it's real or if it's not actually him or not, I mean, did he write in a sense where there would just be never like onomatopoeias, like in a sense where the sentence really never ends? Like if you're writing a story, if you're writing a history book, the way that I've heard the Odyssey and all these things described as like a historical record type thing, is he writing it to be continued on by somebody else, where you just see a bunch of people adding on pieces and pieces and you can tell when the authors defer? Or is it just one continuous thing that seems like it's written all in the same paragraphs as one person? Because you can write something and I can write something. I can train under you for 30 years or something like that. I'm not going to be able to write like you. I'm going to know how you talk, but in my own form, it's going to, you can decipher who's who.
Yeah. It's tough to say, mate, because I'll touch on. I've mentioned it a few times already. The epic cycle, and that's the term given to the actual stories revolving around the Battle of Troy. And there were 7 books in total, of which the Odyssey and the Iliad take up. I think they're the 4th and the 6th out of that cycle. So we don't have the other books to compare and say, oh look, okay, these books are obviously, the syntax is exactly the same as Homer, was written by Homer. Now, we do have a work called the Chrestomathy, which was written by a Byzantine Roman named Patroclus, which has an epitome of the epic cycle. So we can get the flavor and the tenor for what the other books in the epic cycle actually contain. So that's how we know, details like Achilles fought the Amazonian queen Penthesilessa in single combat. Like we wouldn't know that because it's not mentioned explicitly in the Iliad, but we know that occurred in the days following Hector's death. Some Amazons rocked up and just tried to help out with the Trojans, but they ultimately unsuccessful. There's things like that that we found out through there. But look, a pseudonym, that's probably a fine term, I think, for what Homer stands for. I think Homer is the personification of a pseudonym. The story was certainly not to put together by one hand. There's several books that people always cite that would look like they were added later, or they were played with, they were mucked around with. But there's also books which are just pure historical texts as well. Like book 2, I think, is called The Catalogue of Ships, and it basically lists all the towns that put together ships and armies from both sides. That's from the Trojan side and from the Greek side. And it's an amazing record of archaeological sites. All these places have been found to have habitation during the right period, the Mycenaean period, the late 13th, early 12th century BCE. So, all these things lend incredible credence to the Iliad as a historical document. But you've got to remember, these people were pre-literate. Spiritualism, religion, myth, fantasy, they would have had a very, very strong place in their life. So I think if you were to meet Homer, he was writing for his audience. He wasn't writing for us now, or the Greeks 500-600 years down the track who would ultimately go on to venerate his works. He was writing for the people around him. So by its very nature, it's fantastical. Like the gods are living embodiments on the field. They're taking active participation amongst the battles. And that's where they cite the line of demarcation between the age of heroes and the age of bronze, is that the Iliad and the Odyssey are the last times the gods ever worked. Like the gods do things in later times, but they're never on Earth. They never anthropomorphize and become, walking beings on the surface and taking active, changing shapes, making love to humans, having half gods, half heroes, and things like that. His texts are the last ones that have that. So I don't know. Homer's a very special case. Yeah.
Back, I'm alive.
Well done, Robbie.
we'll blame allergies for that. I had a cough and I was trying to hold it in. I was like, I don't want to interrupt him during his epic,
Yeah, I'm sitting over here thinking like, I'm saying something so emotional. I've really touched something. I've got him finally after all these hours of talking.
It was beautiful.
Yeah, bro, it was beautiful. Yeah.
Well, it's just interesting to me because you're trying to find, like, for instance, me asking about, like, I mean, the pseudonym thing, for instance. If we go back to that, I mean, it's just difficult because you're trying to remember history, but it's like, what history are we looking at here? Are we depending on looking at, like, how many people wrote something under the same pseudonym or something of someone that they admired, that they favored? So then you're looking at, like, okay, well, how do we have accounts from Homer in this area, but then you have other people that are writing similar things to Homer? So does that mean that he travel? And it's like, well, no, he might not have traveled, but now you have a fanboy that's writing in the same thing of someone that they admire. And that messes up the whole historical record for the longest time. And, like, you could chalk up a lot of things in ancient history to being half the stuff done by the gods. I mean, everybody was doing everything in the title of the gods or something like that. But I mean, I don't know, it just skews history a little bit where everything ends up being controversial at some point.
Yeah, no, look, you're right. You're right. Like, you got to imagine. So the traveling thing's exactly right. Like, like the word for what Homer was in ancient Greek, I think it's rhapsodos, basically means like road rapper, like guy goes on the road and raps, more or less. Othos is road, I guess, path.
Marky Mark.
I think raps is something to do with like singing or something like that. Like, yeah, basically like that. Anyway, but not Backstreet Boys, no. And they didn't have streets back then. Anyway, so these guys would come to town, and like the citizenry would gather around like some sort of tent or central dining area, and they never traveled. These guys would be lucky to leave 2 or 3 miles from where they grew up. They're farming in the local area. They haven't got time to go traveling. So they're hearing guys from far out places. They don't want to hear the story about, oh yeah, like I cut my finger, got infected, plowing a field for olives. They don't hear stories like that. They want to hear stories about the gods. They want to hear stories about the far off lands and far off places. So that those stories were. They evolved because these things weren't written down until they estimate maybe 725, and at its earliest it's probably 100 years that story was in its form and not being written down. So it would have been getting changed through there. So depending on which rhapsodos, which traveling muse would be giving the story at any given time, because it wasn't written down. It wasn't canonical the way it is now. Now we think of the Iliad as a set thing, and you can't mess with it. And I'm big on it being a set thing, but in the 9th century BCE, it wasn't a set thing at all, and it would have been one of many stories that were traveling around. Just so happened to be probably the best.
Did you ever look around the time period to see what other stories or other things that were similar to that could have been maybe taken its place?
Yeah, look, well, like I said before, there's that epic cycle. So there was, those books, and there's another epic cycle about Thebes, which we were talking about earlier on, which is a real place of legend in early Greece. So that was going around for sure. But we've also have 2 other archaic works that come down to us complete, that are epic in nature. We've got the Theogony, which is a work about how Greek mythology started. So it goes right back to the elemental sort of stuff and works its way through, the Titans and then the gods, and tells the whole story. It's the age. It's a really mythic age sort of focus. If anything, it can preclude or precede the Iliad. For it's just the stuff of legend, pure legend. And then there's the works and days, which is a real sort of, it's a didactic novel designed to teach you how you should behave in the world, and interestingly enough, also build some weird sort of cart. There's an instruction manual in it to build it's like a chariot or like a sort of plow or something like that. It's a really weird section of the book. Anyway, both of those texts are attributed to Hesiod, and he was writing or telling his stories probably about 50 or 60 years after Homer, maybe in that sort of vicinity. So we have those to contextualize the Iliad and the Odyssey in complete form, and they're both written in the same script. It's called a dactylic hexameter, so it's basically 6 feet of music per bar, and it gives it that sort of rhythmic thing, which also made it easy to remember. So that was the style of the time. That was basically like reggae or funk. For like 9th century people, it was the dactylic hexameter. That should go to meter for poetry back then. So yeah, we have a bit of that sort of stuff. And funnily enough, the dactylic hexameter, that became the meter for epic. So anybody that wrote like Virgil's Aeneid, like the Roman author, that was written in dactylic hexameter. So it became just the script of legend. So that's how influential those works were.
When we go back to the beginning of what you said, With the Greco-Roman. Damn, I'm telling you, man, I
He's
got
back. Get
something.
some water.
I know, I got to get some water. We go back to what you said about having anxiety about the Greco-Roman era. Is it just because you might come across a perspective that necessarily you haven't solidified or been focused in for so long? Like, what happens if you find out that there was another event from another place that came across their path briefly, but it might influence your whole idea of what you've learned so far?
Yeah, you're sort of part right. Actually, some of the anxiety is from something else that could happen, but it's not an unknown factor. It's that I know how passionate people can get about Sparta, and the true story, like the actual story, can dissatisfy a lot of people that are just like Sparta, like kicking dudes down wells, like chucking back fireballs with your shields, knocking elephants off cliffs, like killing babies and training from birth to be the ultimate warrior. If you're not sort of going hard on that line, like a lot of people can sort of get upset by because they're so bought into it. So I've got to be sensitive to that, and I can appreciate it as well. Like I think we need ideals to look up to. We can't sort of scrap everything. We can't. The Spartans did a lot that was reprehensible. A lot of the ancient Greeks did, but who cares? They lived 2,500 years ago. Like they're not going to offend us now, and nor should they. So we should just tell the story in its full light. So it's a bit of anxiety around which way to go in regards to the Spartan story, because some of it isn't what people might necessarily want to hear. But the story is still extremely compelling. If you could just sort of step back from the ideology of Sparta.
When it comes into it not looking good on Sparta or people that are in favor of Sparta, I guess looking at it that more bravado warrior type way, what would be like an example of something that wouldn't make them look that good? I mean,
Yeah.
Well, I would say
the bravado.
baby bashing on rocks and all that type of stuff. I mean, people blame Christopher Columbus for doing that as well too, but it's just that it's a horrible thing. Obviously, we know that now, but back then it was a little bit different 2000 something years ago. And people probably don't like you mentioning that or talking about that when it comes to something that they like Sparta so much, or they like this warrior bravado so much. They tend to it's like with JFK. Nobody likes to talk about the aspect of Marilyn Monroe and all this other stuff that, people have said this account's are real, and then they're telling me it's not. And I'm like, well, hold on a second. We have an actual record that states all about this stuff. Now, how to the extent of how far it goes, but people don't like that aspect. They want to focus on only the good stuff and leave out the negatives. I'm like, you have to bring both conversations to the argument. You can't really just have one side, or you're teaching one side of history. That's not necessarily what we should be doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, it's to be honest, I'm fine with the bravado warrior thing. Like the Spartans definitely, you'd be mad not to focus on that. The smashing babies against rocks, that sort of stuff, likely didn't happen anyway. Like the Spartans didn't have enough people. If they were practicing infanticide, it wouldn't be any different to how other Greek cities would have practiced infanticide. Like, kids with disabilities in those days were liabilities. They didn't have any health care. So
wait, did they kill kids with disabilities?
I would suggest that would be a general thing. Yeah, definitely.
Jesus,
yeah, absolutely.
What was it, like the 20th century? We just like open up the back door of a car and let them just
let them go. Yeah, well, nobody would take them in. So now we have churches and functions that would take in a child like that, and at least give it some sort of life. There was nothing like that in those days. There's you can read some truth into the way the Spartans inspected babies. The board of ephors was charged with inspecting every single baby, and if you can glean from the text that if it was deformed in any way, they probably expose it. But they weren't practicing mass infanticide. A lot of babies died in childbirth. That was very common back in those days. A lot of mothers died in childbirth. For various reasons wouldn't survive for the first odd weeks. So yeah, it possibly happened. But no, what really concerns me about the story is there's often an association with sort of right-wing extremism and the Spartan sort of nationalistic ideal. Like certainly the Nazis perpetrated some evils with Spartan influence. They had Spartan symbolism. They certainly consider themselves the descendants of the Spartans. In a sense, they had some spurious genealogy that got them there. That element can be upsetting for people. Most people who are just madly into Sparta, like myself, are just madly into Sparta. They don't have any sort of extreme tendencies, a desire to pervert a historical narrative and, place it as a justification for a certain type of behavior in the modern era. That is the antithesis of what I was saying earlier on about imposing things on the background, like, using the past against the future as well is terrible. So that's my biggest concern is because I've touched that in the past a few times, and that's just come back to bite me every single time.
Well, it's like if someone has I have a favorite thing for JFK, doesn't mean I necessarily agreed with who JFK was as a president. I'm just fascinated with the fact that there's like this conspiracy in history. I mean, you being fascinated with Spartan history or just the Spartans in general doesn't mean you necessarily want the world to turn back to what it was like during the Sparta era and have that continue their methods. No, it just means that you're interested in a certain account of history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am like, and I'm interested in the full story. Like, I haven't stayed away from anything. I think, there's things to cover. Obviously, like pedophilia, child abuse, state sanctioned rape or abduction, slavery. Obviously, these are things that are hot topics, and I've covered them in as illicit detail as possible. Because I want the whole story to be told. Those things you can feel a little bit of hate from certain people, but they're not people that are really appreciating history and the like. But then it's the hate you get from people who have perverted the history. That's the real vitriolic sort of ones. It's like, I just want to stay away from that as much as possible. The show's not about that. The show should be more about just the Spartan story in the cold daylight. And I think most of the people that still listen to the show, they're in it for that. They don't want the glory, the gold, the screaming off cliffs and things like that. They want the real Spartan story. So yeah, it's a matter of time just to get that right, because it's a really important thing. I think I owe it to the guys that have stuck with me this long to tell the story properly and make it enjoyable.
Do you think that's a similar experience to people who actually wrote down the historical record of it probably felt? Should we include this detail? Should we not include this detail? I mean, in a sense, you're doing the same thing when you're doing your podcast episodes. You're leaving a historical record, or you're focusing on historical subjects. If you have a bunch of things and one person's like, where's this incident that happened, you didn't include in there just because you knew that would be something that would be bad or that would be a hard episode to do. Nobody thinks about the mental anguish you might be going through just trying to be able to cover an episode in full detail. That might be something so gruesome or so horrible in a sense. And people look at it and they hear it and they go, this person just skipped out on this part of history. You must be a fanboy on the one side. I mean, I get now the controversial aspects of things.
Yeah, well, you'd see it in what you're doing at the moment, particularly when you go into any conspiracy theory. And at any time, there's always going to be fierce partisans from both sides coming at you, like from your side, saying, you got this wrong, and from the other side calling you an absolute lunatic. So, you can't really, you're in the devil of a situation there. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't, Robbie.
Well, you got to look at it like this, especially if you talk about something like MK Ultra or something like that. That gets labeled a conspiracy, but we know that's real. And I'm just like, I'd rather know the full history. Like, I'm a historical person when it comes to just wanting the historical record. I didn't appreciate it until after once I started doing the podcast and actually talking to historical, archaeologists or just historians in general. I realized the real story, it might be like difficult to, give to someone like in an interview or be able to tell the general public and have them accept it for the times or whatever method you were thinking of. But I'm like, man, if the government's going to lie about their actions and they keep a record elsewhere to find out the true historical facts later, I'm like, you might as well just be transparent and cover your ass in that moment rather than cover your ass later. Because if people find out it's going to be a lie, imagine if you look back and you start realizing that there's, you come across a narrative or you come across a perspective of someone that was against the Spartans. Maybe you read a village perspective of a child that was in that village and the Spartans came and raided their village and did all this type of stuff. Then you learn from that perspective and you found that you were actually more interested in that one than the original Spartans. And then you end up learning everything that you thought about the Spartans to be wrong.
Yeah, that's very challenging. I just want to go back to that. You touched on, lack of trust in sort of, government narratives and institutions. And that's gone crazy. Like, especially like in your country, our country, there's a steep distrust as well of the government at the moment and any so-called experts on just about anything, but I listen to a lot of news from over in America because I've always been a sort of firm believer, like what goes on there is going to happen here in 10 years. And it's been pretty true. Like it's the gap is starting to close up a little bit, but it'll if it's happening in America, it will happen in Australia. We'll have our chance that we won't learn anything from the benefits you guys get from what you're doing, and we won't learn anything by what goes wrong over there either. We'll just copy. We'll just do exactly the same thing and learn our own lessons. But it seems like all the things that have happened under the under Trump administration and the Biden administration, it's gone crazy, like how little you can trust, people that for a long time over here we would have assumed were just the gospel truth, like the New York Times, for example, CNN, like the stuff that comes out on those shows, and on the other side, like Fox, it's just crazy, like how like there's almost nothing that can be agreed upon as truth at the moment in America. Like that's a real danger. Like, do you actually see? I mean, a breakdown of truth is what breaks down most great societies over the years. How do you see that? Like being in the States, how do you feel that? Do you see a way out of it? Do you see like like a future where you can agree on some stuff again?
I, I mean, it comes in tides, I guess. I just find it funny when there's this long conspiracy running about like the media influence to not go against a certain narrative. I mean, we all talk about it, we all kind of know it's true, but then I have a document to back it up from like the 60s that shows like physical proof of like, don't go against this narrative. And then you have people like, I mean, I don't watch CNN or Fox, but I mean, it's funny when people go like Tucker Carlson saying all this outrageous stuff. And it's like, it's different from the narrative. And it's just like, he's just a talking head until eventually he gets back on the other side again. Like that's the thing is like none of these news broadcasters, they think that we're like me and you could be best friends for 15 years. And then I say something that doesn't agree with the way we've been agreeing for the longest time. And then you can just cut me out of the circle. And the next thing I know, I'm going against you in a sense. And it's like, that's the thing is you don't notice the spider web until you step on it. For me, and I've been asked this question already by a friend of mine, Campbell, who was on here, would you want to know the truth of like the historical thing? I was like, yeah. I was like, I just want full transparency on everything. It doesn't matter if you think I'm going to like it or not, but I think about just understanding the reality that you live in rather like when I started uncovering, like I was always interested in government stuff, but when you start learning different parts about history, like different historical aspects, like George Washington's teeth weren't made of cherry wood, they were made of slave teeth. That sounds like a minor detail. You don't really need to glommer on. Society freaked the hell out about it. And it's like, yeah, because you can't build up a Superman. You got to understand there are no Supermen. What and when you build up the idea of a Superman, don't be surprised when they find out he smokes cigarettes. Like that's what you kind of have to go with. And that's how and it's a controversial take. I know that people don't like that idea of like knowing all the good and the bads and what we do. I believe there are things that have to be done that necessarily it's going to look horrible. And I understand that, but I just want to know that you did that because of the fact that of whatever that is. You can't just lie and say we never did that. Like the one thing I fucking hate, and it's a divisiveness amongst populations, which is the idea that this doesn't exist. And you're like, what? Like, I know it exists. So where's the file on it? Like I showed you, Joylon West. I showed you the files with his name stamped at the bottom of it, but then the CIA agency that owns him says we don't have any file that this person doesn't even exist, and you're not required to have that information. It's like, you're lying to me now. You're making me seem crazy. When I start seeming crazy, it's like paranoia. And then you get into this aspect. Now you're just messing with people's minds. I mean, I'd rather just know the historical value. I'm pretty sure you're probably standing in the same boat as that as well, too, because I think a lot of actions can be justified, but you can't justify the lying on top of it. I mean,
No.
that's one of the most difficult things when you look at an archaeologist or you look at a historian's record on something. You got to also understand is their take on that incident is going to be different than the other historians who have covered that incident. I know people that have different take on the Vietnam War than everyone else that has a different take on the Vietnam War. People remember the Agent Orange, and I've talked to these people on my show. People that talk about the Agent Orange aspect. People talk about the government's influence over there. People talk about the danger of the Viet Cong. Then there's the heroin issue, and you just get into this aspect like who's got the proper account of it, or all of them are valid, but depends on which narrative they were pushing the hardest. I mean, it's all in like I just consider it information. I don't need to freak out about it and get into this like if I knew that the government killed JFK or if I knew the government was behind a bunch of different shit, would I lose my mind? No, but I'd like to know about it. I feel safer in that reality. You know what I mean? You don't necessarily, and it's like people say like taking the blue pill or the red pill. That's a very weird and difficult like kind of discussion to have because it's like, yeah, it is kind of like that, but at the same time, it doesn't help anybody. Like I don't feel safer at night thinking all this type of stuff or knowing the real documented history behind like MLK and all this type of stuff. No, I don't feel comfortable knowing that at all, but I also want to know it because it also you don't want to live in a false reality, I would say. I mean, we're all probably living in a false reality. I mean, I'm pretty sure my parents told me multiple times they love me, and I don't believe that.
They still let you live there, so then they don't think too lowly of you anyway. You know, and probably rent free too.
No, I pay a
I
lot.
don't know.
I have a good amount.
Ah, good boy, good
Yeah,
boy.
I'm
Yeah,
a
no, look, you're right. Look, I mean, that's all I want. All I want is the truth. Doesn't matter whether it comes to um, history, historical thought. You know, the current situation. The fact that governments would hide things. I can understand, you know, certain things being classified. Like, you know, like, yeah, I don't need to know how to make a nuclear bomb. You know, like, A, I wouldn't know what to do with the instructions, and B, I don't need to make one. So you can understand why there's certain things. You know, there could be a lot of danger if I got a copy of how to make a nuclear bomb for the world. So I understand certain things are going to be classified, but things like, you know, what you're looking into at the moment, JFK, I can't understand why. You know, like that would be held in such secrecy. Like I was saying, I think maybe I said it off air, maybe we said it on air, but like, you know, if they had the truth, they could put it out there for people and it would put all this bullshit to rest. You know, people are just, it's just another thing people are divided on. If it was the truth, you know, there's the truth's an inarguable thing, you know, like it is what it is. There's no if buts or maybe about it, no way around it. The truth is the truth. But that's the problem with the language these days, is that, you know, the people that speak, I've heard the term lived truth or lived experience, you know, trumping actual truths, you know, so, you know, what a person's experienced, you know, what they've, you know, transcendentally been affected by, or, you know, through their long distance ancestors of which they had nothing to do with, you know, feel certain truths are applicable, which are subjective truths. When subjective truths start getting in the way of the objective ones, that's when, you know, I start having a problem. And I think that's where we as a society are going to have a massive problem, because if we can't agree on what the truth is, we're going to have a lot of trouble. And the government is largely responsible for this complete and utter lack of trust. I mean, obviously, you know, regardless of which side of the fence you fell on, you know, you'd have to see that there was some BS going on in the last 3 years with, you know, COVID responses globally. And then looking back over time, you know, there's all these things that people have, like UFOs are one, obviously. I know you've had some chats about those, JFK, you know, all these conspiracy theories that we have no answer to. Like, people fucking know what went down, you know, like somebody knows what went down. Somewhere in some cabinet is a file with the information, or a cassette with a recording of every single one of these things, you know, that could irrefutably prove beyond doubt what actually went down. And guess what? All the conspiracy theories go up in smoke. The mere fact that they won't release it, it's like they're perpetuating it, you know, trying to keep us antagonized.
well. I mean, this came out, like I talked about this on my show, and it sounds crazy when I say it, but energy weapons. So Biden made an official statement about people that were injured from energy weapons. They don't necessarily know if it was us, but what they do use energy weapons for is to disperse like riots and things of that sort. It
Yeah,
causes
yeah. This. Yeah,
yeah, so it gets into this area like where they're thinking, is this some of this brain fog? Is that what's causing people's brain fog? Is this thing? And they realize that a small portion of the population might have actually been exposed to some of this. A lot of people that were in the military were exposed to some of this as well too. And it's like, that sounds nuts, me just saying it. But if you have the document and they made an official statement about it as well too, and I've read it on air before, and then people go, holy shit, it's real. And it's like, you don't want people's minds to shatter because they find out your lies. But you got to look at like where I stand from it. Have there always been bad individual actors throughout history? Yes. Does that mean it's your president? No. But I'm just saying there's always people, always an inner cog machine that's been working a lot longer. Like, do you think that the president who gets elected for 4 years compared to someone that's been in that administration for 20 or however long, and the government, Supreme Court, who has the most power? Who knows the situation better? Who knows the grooves of everything like that? I mean, best example is Alan Dulles, the guy in charge of MK Ultra, who was in charge of making up the Warren Commission. That dude was fired, supposed to be a civilian, and he was at it. They found him on a CIA farm, like this location place where agents of the CIA, directors of the CIA, were taking advice from a civilian person. And he's acting like he's still involved in the CIA. And then Kennedy gets killed, and then he gets rehired back in. I mean, when you look at the record of it, you could say he didn't look like somebody that was supposed to be fired. He looked like someone that was just waiting for his time to jump back in. And that's why people blame him. I'm not saying it's him, but I'm saying there's always been bad individual actors. We know this from like the Nazis, for instance. You could point out a lot of Nazis that were involved in horrible shit, but you could also point out the accounts and diaries that I've read of people that were involved that felt like if they tried to get out of this, their family was going to be killed. So you got like weird things in history where I just go, there's a historical record of bad pieces of shit throughout history. You can look at kings, for instance. You can look at all these tyrants. It's the same thing. Just the platform's different. So when you understand that a little bit more, I think like the idea of like conspiracy, I mean, that was created by the CIA in like the 50s. What people talk about conspiracy, what they think is fantasy, which is this idea of like, and that there is some of that as well too. I know people that bring up the Anaki when it comes to JFK. I'm like, I don't think that's fucking true. But you start getting into more realistic things like trying to kill Castro. Did you know the same thing that they poisoned Castro's cigars with was heroin? Like it's botulium, something like that. And you start realizing there's a thing called blockbusting, where I don't know if you know what this is, but back in the day, like my grandparents' age, they would knock on your door and say, hey, this certain ethnicity is moving in your neighborhood. You might want to sell your house now before your property value goes down. And they used to get people to move and sell their homes all because they thought African American people or something like that were moving in their neighborhood. That's a real legit thing. You can look that up. When you start looking into the heroin trade or the heroin epidemic, when the sparks started coming over here in the States, you start realizing that where are we getting our heroin from? Vietnam, all these other sources. And you start getting into this aspect of like, what's one thing a family won't do when it comes up to elections and their son just died of a heroin overdose? Do you think they're going to give a fuck about who they vote for? No. And you start realizing like there's a long track record. And I had a guy who did a documentary about this, like Tupac and the war with the FBI. I mean, Tupac family was in the Black Panther Party. He was uniting gangs on a more of like a truce front for the idea of political, ideas of being like, hey, we need to get more stuff for us rather than focus on what they're always kind of just reiterating the same thing and making our lives hell. And he was uniting these gangs, and then there's this giant crazy thing, shootout and all this stuff when people blame Biggie and all this. I mean, it's crazy, but it's just like it's very, very strategic and very, very smart. And that's how wars are fought. I mean, it's like I said, it goes down a little bit darker route, and I'm going to end up ranting about some shit, but it's not crazy to think that someone out there.
Just let me jump in. I've just got to say, the thought of a popular uprising of Los Angeles rappers led by Tupac against the government would be gold. That would be solid gold.
Well, they needed gang violence, because gang violence was keeping a lot of things that they could push when it comes to like, we're going to help get these horrible gang violence off the streets, when really they were incentivizing the gang violence to steer up. I mean, they didn't just, none of those people got heroin from overseas. It was given to them by somebody. And who was that was given to them? Who opened up the doors for drugs to be released into America? Well, that was the government. And then you look at like the government experimentation with LSD. LSD was this, if you ever hear anybody's accounts of it, this mind altering drug, this amazing thing with an experience they could never really reiterate into words. It was so like mind bending. Well, the government found what that is in the 50s, and they decided, okay, if it's a mind altering drug, what happens if we shatter the shit out of your mind? And they ramped it up even higher and had all these people go crazy. I mean, that's the movie Men Who Stare at Goats, with remote viewing and using LSD. That's real stuff, and it's linked into like a lot of like historical shit, and it kind of leads back into Manson in a sense. But I mean, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was in a government institution when he was like in his teenager years, and they think they created the Unabomber, this guy who was getting shocks and shit to try and correct his mental attitude, and then might have actually made it even worse. I mean, you just get into this aspect of like, it's just fucking with people because you have more power. And that's like the same shit you see throughout history. Kings used to mess with slaves and make them do crazy shit, or I'll chop your head off or something like that, or kill your family or whatever the hell it was. It was an idea of fear. And fear is the best motivator to get people to do whatever the hell you want. I mean, look what we did during this pandemic. People were scared of a dangerous thing, and they decided to displace their fear into the government. And then what happened later? You had the government make medical choices for you, and then you have something like Roe v. Wade happen. I mean, that's more conspiratorial, but you have this aspect of like, you opened up the door for them to start making decisions into your life. It's giving them more power, and nobody with power gives up power. I mean, it's this idea of, you give me an inch, I'm going to take a mile. And more, we don't have to get down that.
You're right. Yeah. You're 100% right. You know, that is the first tool of an autocratic state. It's fear. It is fear 100%. It's control of the narrative, obviously. You know, one party, one nation, one story. You know, China does that very well to this day. All the great empires have, but yeah, the people live in a state of, I wouldn't say abject fear, but they definitely live in a state of deep concern for their family's safety. You know, if they don't perpetuate, like become a useful idiot, basically, one of the masses who just goes along with it, of which, the vast majority, 98, 99% of all people in any such regime, are completely against, but they're all too scared of the other 1% to say anything about it, and that's once people start self-censoring and start, performing behaviors that they know to be inherently wrong, they've got you, you're captured. And I don't see the way out of it historically, when it's happened, except by war. No single culture, to my knowledge, and this is something I'm not aware of, has gone to a period of deep strife, division, absolutely riven with a separation of culture, come back from that brink without, devolving into war. So that's the real fear.
Well, you're in a weird place when Google sends out a message saying we're eliminating disinformation off the internet to better protect you. Do you really think a fucking $1 billion company gives a fuck about you when they sell your data and all your other shit to other sources? I mean, come on. Like, if you can't question that, if you accept that at face value, then that's what scares me. Is I just want more people to question stuff. It doesn't mean sparking up an uprising or anything. It just means just question more, like notice the bullshit sometimes.
Yeah, critically think about things, like be a little bit more interested and a little bit more intellectually busy rather than being intellectually lazy. That'd be, really all you can ask for. I hope it doesn't go to war, like, especially being a father, the last thing I want to do is raise a child in a world that, was any worse than the one that I brought him into. That's the greatest fear of any parent. You always want, better for your children. So,
Best advice I can give you, and it's the best advice. I mean, it's not even mine. It's my buddy's, Robert Dumont. I agree with him 100%. He goes, if you're taking this road every single day, and at this point, when you get to this road, there's a toll booth, and the toll booth decides that today, without letting anybody know, they just changed the price to $1 more, and you don't have that money. You're either going to pay whatever that is, or you're going to turn around and go home. One of two options. He goes, nope, fuck that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to park my car and wait till someone gives me that money to go pay for that toll. And it's just something where I'm like, I didn't even see that option, but it's like, yeah, become the problem to where they have to appease you so you don't mess up the rest of the flow of traffic. But there's kind of one or two people that would show up to it. Damn, I don't have the money for it. And they'll either ask or they'll turn around and go home, or they'll pay the extra fee because the price changed. But then if you create the problem, then you're that exception and they go, hey, we can't, like, the Grammys, for instance, when you win an Emmy, you can win an Emmy by writing the music to whatever it is, but they don't let people know that because it's like cheating. And that's just Hollywood. Hollywood's like, well, we'll engrave you with one, but it's not real. Like, we can't officially give it to you on stage because we don't want other people thinking they can just write music and win an Emmy. And it's like, what? You don't want to incentivize good work? And it's like, well, that's just not how you're supposed to win it. You're supposed to win it by directing the thing or doing that. They can only give you in those two categories. And that's from Kurt Metzinger and Kyle Dunnigan, who are on Joe Rogan speaking about that. And it's just like, yeah, that's Hollywood, but that's the world. You're going to be that problem, and they want to make sure that their system runs smoothly so everyone else keeps following it. And when you're that problem, they'll try and hide that problem. They'll try and make sure that problem isn't there, or do anything to appease you just so you get out of their way so they can continue the system in a line.
Yeah. I think, we've got to start, coming together more as, like as a society. The problem is, like, the way things are, everything's so divided, because we are so separated. We've got our own little worlds and our phone in front of us and all that, and we've lost that, I think, that sense of community. And that's where it's all coming from. Like, it's so easy to say the most heinous of things to somebody when they're just an avatar on Twitter. The things that I've had people say to me on Twitter over the years, nobody would ever say it to my face, not because I'm a big tough guy, but because it would result in conflict regardless. Like, you just wouldn't say some of this sort of stuff, because you get smacked in the face for it one way or the other. And that's, I think we've lost that. We've stopped seeing people, as actual people. We're starting to see them more and more as, like, just some random thing on a screen, not worthy of consideration. So we need to find a way back to ourselves, I think, because if we rely on the institutions to get us there as our holy leaders, we're going to wind up prisoners to a jail of our own making, because they will not be setting us down the right path.
Disassociated responsibility. It's the best type of responsibility.
Yeah,
Steve,
yeah.
I appreciate you for doing my show, man. Is there a place where people can find you?
Yeah, you can get me at www.spartanhistorypodcast.com.au or just Google Spartan History Podcast.
Got your own site now, huh?
Yeah. For the moment, I'm actually taking it down soon. It's been hacked, so like not in a bad way, but it just keeps spamming me with like members from places that don't exist, and it's just sort of become a bit of a nightmare. So I did actually announce it's going to come down in a while, but I'll always be Spartan History Podcast. So
Just make a link tree.
yeah, it gives me an excuse to get out of the website too, Rob. It's so much work. You know?
Well, Linktree is free and it has all your links on one thing, so people can just click your link tree and then click whatever they want to see: YouTube, Spotify, whatever the hell.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
It's pretty. I mean, it's relatively all you gotta do is create an account. But I have a website, but it's not mine. It's my cousin. He made it for me. He's been making it for 4 years. So people are like, sign up on your website. I'm like, I don't fucking own that. So
he just made it. He just made it for you.
Yeah.
It's very opportunistic, isn't it? Oh, it'll pay dividends one day. But yeah, man, thanks for having me on. It's been really good to catch up.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.